Alright, so over the last couple of days, I'm sure that most of you guys have heard about some of the chaos unfolding over in Tennessee as multiple Democratic state lawmakers were straight up expelled from their seats, like kicked out of the government over their participation in protests surrounding gun reform in the aftermath of that horrific Nashville shooting that we were covering on this channel, where 3 adults and 3 innocent 9-year-old children were massacred. And so I got some details here from the New York Times in terms of what actually unfolded and how completely insane and authoritarian this situation is. And then we're going to hear from some of the lawmakers directly on what their thoughts are about this entire process that has been unfolding. So here to start us off from the New York Times, they say Tennessee GOP punishes 2 Democrats by throwing them out of the House. So what could have possibly justified this situation? They say the Tennessee House voted on Thursday to expel 2 Democrats 1 week after they interrupted debate by leading protesters in a call for stricter gun laws in the wake of a shooting that left six dead at a Christian school. Okay, so how dare these representatives who represent communities who want stricter gun reform legislation, how dare they participate and stand alongside some of their own constituents in order to call for measures that could, I don't know, prevent the massacre of children within their districts that they are representing? I mean, just a completely unacceptable situation, apparently, according to the Republican Party within Tennessee. They say the extraordinarily punitive action against the Democrats, Representative Justin Jones and Justin J. Pearson, who we will hear from here in a second, for an act of protest marks just the 3rd time since the Civil War era that the Tennessee House has expelled a lawmaker from its ranks and threatens to further inflame the partisan rancor within a bitterly divided state. Okay, 3rd time since the Civil War. 3rd time since the Civil War that this has happened, and it was because they were essentially, bringing out bullhorns and chanting and protesting with some of the young people within Tennessee who, I don't know, have a crazy demand like not wanting to be killed as they go to school, I guess. But they say an effort to expel a 3rd Democrat, Representative Gloria Johnson, who had stood by the 2 men in the front of the chamber and joined in the chants during the protest, fell short by 1 vote. Okay, so now I want to jump to one of the clips here where Gloria Johnson herself is giving a perspective in terms of why she wasn't expelled, but these other 2 young black men were expelled from the Tennessee state legislature. So let's just go ahead and jump into this real quick.
Yes, and we're going to fight hard to get him back.
Why do you feel like there was a difference in the outcome?
I will answer your question. It might have to do with the color of our skin.
Okay, so if you didn't hear the question there, the question was, why do you think that these 2 young black representatives were expelled and you, as a white woman, was not expelled? And basically she, insinuates that it had something to do with the fact that she is white instead of being black, like these other 2 representatives. Now, I'll leave that up to you guys in terms of how much of that played a role in this directly. Now, obviously, again, as they pointed out in this article, they were like 1 vote short of expelling Gloria as well for her actions during this protest. So, take that for what you will. I mean, maybe that 1 representative had a change of heart at the last minute or something when it came to Gloria, but clearly, they're still hell-bent on taking these authoritarian steps in order to remove people from the chamber who happen to disagree with them on gun reform legislation. But they say the expulsions of 2 of the state's youngest black representatives, carried out before lawmakers were scheduled to leave for the Easter weekend, were a stunning culmination to the week that saw the conclusion of the funerals for 6 killed in the shooting. Hundreds of students and teachers walked out of school to protest the General Assembly and a vitriolic debate about democracy in the state. They say as protesters flooded the Capitol again on Thursday, their chants of gun control now and not one more were deafening outside the House chamber. And after the final vote, the crowds in the galleys burst into angry yells and cries of "shame on you" with fists held high above their heads. So credit to everybody who actually showed up to these protests. I mean, clearly it's a difficult situation. You're dealing with a state like Tennessee, which obviously has very conservative leanings in regards to gun reform legislation. Of course, as we're going to get to in this article, basically the Republican strategy for addressing the threat of mass shootings is just like increasing police militarization and trying to make sure that, like, you know, teachers are armed and students are armed and babies are armed and everybody is armed with a gun, so that if this kind of situation happens, then we'll have the security protocols and we'll be able to address that kind of a situation, while completely ignoring the fact that that is not actually going to prevent the shooting from taking place in the first place. Maybe you would have more people who are like errantly firing guns all over the place in order to try to stop the mass shooting, but it's not addressing the core root of the problem here, which is the proliferation of guns around this country. Okay, so they continue here saying that the ousted lawmakers could run again for their seats. So probably not the last time that you're going to hear from these guys, right? But they say their expulsions temporarily leave thousands of residents in Memphis and Nashville, two of the largest cities in the entire state of Tennessee, without any representation in the House of Representatives in the final weeks of a legislative session in which increasingly hardline Republicans from rural districts have used the power of their supermajority to clamp down on the state's more liberal cities and muscle through conservative priorities. Okay, so I don't know what to call this other than just complete anti-democratic authoritarianism. I mean, you are literally not only just silencing the voices or just ignoring the voices of the constituents, these young people who are going out to protest for gun legislation to make sure that they are not murdered while they are going to school. Not only are you ignoring their demands, but then you're also turning around and straight up removing the only representation that they have within the state government. Because what? Because these lawmakers chose to stand with their own constituents in order to make some of these basic demands. I mean, again, it's just a completely insane situation here, but they say the lawmakers who were expelled readily acknowledge that the outburst violated the House's rule of conduct. Okay, keep in mind, this is the third time that this has happened since the fucking Civil War, okay? And they may have violated some norms and ethics surrounding the House decorum rules, okay? That's what we're really talking about here. They weren't leading some sort of a violent insurrection, as some people on the right would have you believe, okay? Entirely peaceful protests where young people are showing up and saying, we don't want to be killed in schools. They were participating in those protests knowing that the Tennessee state legislature with this Republican supermajority has absolutely no intention whatsoever of actually addressing the underlying issues at play here. So they participate in this protest with their constituents, okay, using their platform, using their power that they have in order to advocate for some real underlying solutions, and they are kicked out of their seats for this. I mean, I've almost never seen a situation like this actually unfold. Now, the most ironic part, all of this, they say here that Republicans have derided the behavior and invoked the violence of January 6th with the riot at the U.S. Capitol to describe the gun control protest, which was peaceful. Okay, so this is something we have seen across the board ever since January 6th. It's like it completely rotted Republicans' brains. I mean, listen, I'm not going to be somebody who's going to sit here and say like, oh, you know, January 6th was this like organized coup attempt and they were like an inch away from overthrowing the U.S. government and installing Donald Trump as the God King dictator or something like that. I'm not going to go that far, but at the same time, like, we all saw what happened on January 6th. You had motherfuckers out there with MAGA flagpoles trying to jab at police officers. You had people with bear spray. You had people with, some of those hand ties to presumably tie up U.S. lawmakers. And all of this was in service of trying to halt the certification of a completely valid election. Okay, so when Republicans analyze that situation, they'll turn around and they'll say, oh, it was a peaceful protest. And, oh, these people are being treated so unfairly. And look at them. They're being thrown in jail for these actions. And it's just so completely unfair. But then when it comes to students within their own state who are making the most basic demands that they want to feel safe when they go to school every day, okay, suddenly that becomes like this violent insurrection, and they're comparing that to January 6th. I mean, it's completely insane, okay? You didn't have young people who were showing up to these protests and beating the shit out of police officers, right, and breaking their way into the chamber. They were just doing chants and trying to advocate for what they see as the most common sense, response to this kind of a repeated situation here in the United States, which just magically doesn't happen around the rest of the world, with children being massacred when they're trying to go to school. But they continue here saying that the expulsions come as national political divisions have continued to seep into local politics. They say in Tennessee, the General Assembly has carved up the state's more Democratic leading cities and all but guaranteed that the majority of political representation is determined in Republican primaries instead of in general elections, leaving lawmakers more responsive to a far-right base. Okay, so, I mean, again, this is something that I talked about yesterday in my video on the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, right? You're talking about a state like Wisconsin where they have essentially gerrymandered these districts to the point where even if Democrats win an overwhelming majority of the popular vote, they have absolutely zero chance of actually winning even a marginal majority within the state legislature. There was that last election where they won like 54% of the total popular vote. They ended up with like 34% of the state legislature seats. So this is the kind of gerrymandering that we're talking about here, okay? It doesn't just go for Wisconsin, it also clearly goes here for Tennessee. And one of the tangential effects of that they're pointing out in this article, which is absolutely true, is that if you gerrymander these districts so that they're not actually competitive in a bipartisan way between a Democrat and a Republican, right? If you actually gerrymander these to the point where it's guaranteed that Republicans are going to be in control, well then you are leaving them more susceptible to the whims of what the Republican base, the most fervent far-right people within this country, actually want them to do. And so they keep drifting further and further to the right and are more susceptible to what those demands actually are. So they continue here saying that after the attack at the private Covenant school last week, hundreds of residents began marching towards the state capitol to demand that the legislature restrict access to guns. Republicans, led by Governor Bill Lee, have largely focused their response on toughening school security, including passing a measure through the House on Thursday that would require schools to develop a safety plan and implement stricter security measures. Okay, so again, doubling down on trying to create schools into these sort of like mini police states where you have multiple armed guards, maybe the teachers are armed, maybe the students are armed, who the fuck knows, give a gun to everybody and that's going to magically solve the problem that is at hand here, okay? That is the only response that they have. They are not even willing to entertain the idea that the proliferation of guns in this country may be, at least to some degree, part of the factor in this conversation. I mean, again, it's like Republicans just constantly act as if we don't have other countries around the world that we can compare ourselves to. I mean, again, you want to talk about like mental health, for example. Oh, mental health is this grand problem. We need to address that here in the United States. Okay, fine. If you want to go that route, then sure, I believe in Medicare for all. I believe that mental health care should be included as a fundamental right for every single American citizen. Okay, that would be step number one in actually addressing that problem. Now, do Republicans actually want to spend more money on addressing mental health and the lack of mental health care in this country? No, absolutely not. So they're not really serious about that as a part of the actual solution to this issue, right? So that's number one. But number two, again, we can look around the world to other comparable OECD countries and we can see that it seems like the United States is the only country that seems to have this regularity when it comes to school shootings or mass shootings in general within our country. So what is the differentiating factor between the United States and a country like Germany or the UK or France or any of these other countries that don't have mass shootings like we do? Is it, number one, that we have infinitely more mentally ill people in this country, or is it that we have infinitely more accessibility to guns in this country? Okay, that's the conversation that they don't want to have, because no, we don't have significantly higher degrees of mental illness in the United States. We don't have universal health care, so we don't have a meaningful way to actually address that across the board. But at the same time, it's like, it's very clear that the factor here is the guns. Now, again, I mean, I'm not somebody who's like, okay, we should abolish the entirety of guns within the United States. I don't think that would be feasible. I don't think that's even something I would necessarily support. But some of these weapons are just not weapons that need to be in the hands of random civilians, where you can just walk to a store and buy an assault weapon that is going to be able to massacre a large number of people in a very short amount of time with essentially barely any guardrails. But that seems to be what Republicans want in terms of the world that we should be living in right now. So let's just go ahead and jump ahead here. So I want to get I want to get some testimony here directly from some of the lawmakers that were actually personally expelled during this entire process. So here we have first Justin J. Peterson, who is, speaking ahead of this House vote to actually expel him from the chamber. So let's just go ahead and listen to a little bit of what he has to say on this matter here.
If you look at what it takes to expel a member, or what it should take, most of the times that a member in the Tennessee state legislature have gotten expelled, in the last two times in particular, One, the guy committed sexual assault against 22 people. The other committed bribery. We broke a house rule because we're fighting for kids who are dying from gun violence and people in our communities who want to see an end to the proliferation of weaponry in our communities, and that leads to our expulsion. This is not democracy. This is not what it is supposed to look like, and everybody needs to be very afraid and very worried that there are people in positions of power who are using and wielding that power to expel people who are duly elected to their seats. We came here to fight for our constituents. We came here to lift up the issues of people who are suffering. 6 people died in Nashville at the Covenant School. 3 were 9 years old. But instead of focusing on that, Representative Jones, Representative Johnson, and myself are being expelled from the State House because we said we cannot do business as usual.
Okay, so again, he's 100% correct. And again, I don't know how to interpret this other than just straight up authoritarian measures that are being taken in order to try to silence some of the very few people within the Tennessee State House that are willing to actually bring up these issues in a serious way. So now I want to jump to the next representative here, who is basically going to give his perspective in terms of some of the hypocritical nature in terms of why they are being expelled versus some of the things that some Republican legislators have been able to get away with. So let's just go ahead and jump into this clip here real quick.
Let's talk about expulsion. For years, one of your colleagues who was an admitted child molester sat in this chamber. No expulsion. One member sits in this chamber who was found guilty of domestic violence. No expulsion. We had a former speaker sit in this chamber who is now under federal investigation. No expulsion. We have a member still under federal investigation. No expulsion. We had a member pee in another member's chair in this chamber. No expulsion. In fact, they're in leadership.
What the fuck?
In the governor's administration. And so once again, what you're saying to us, since you're trying to put us on trial, I'll say what you're really putting on trial is the state of Tennessee.
I mean, what the fuck do we even say about this, man? What do you even say about this situation? You have somebody who's accused of, like, you know, multiple counts, dozens of counts almost of sexual misconduct, sexual assault. You have somebody who's accused of you know, sexual predation. Okay, they're still sitting members. You have somebody who is accused of pissing in the chair of another representative, and they're not expelled. None of those people are expelled. But you get expelled for being somebody who is actually standing up for the interests of the people who you are representing within your district. Okay, that's the situation that we're actually talking about here. I mean, again, you know, listen, this situation obviously has been getting a lot of traction. I'm glad this has become like sort of a national story right now, because it's just such a perfect embodiment of the current state of US politics now, where it's like people who are just calling for the bare fucking minimum. Okay, I mean, we're talking about a situation where just in the United States, the only country, the only developed country on the face of the fucking planet where this kind of thing happens on a regular basis, we get absolutely no legitimate solutions, especially within these conservative held states like Tennessee. No legitimate solutions that are actually put on the table to address this problem in a meaningful capacity. Then you have representatives, okay, who actually have the audacity to stand up and to use their voice, to use their platform to fight for their constituents. You know, some of them young students who are just terrified of being massacred when they go to school. Okay, and the response from this Tennessee supermajority is to not only, again, ignore the will of the people who are calling for more strict gun legislation. Now, keep in mind, these common sense gun reforms that we're talking about here, things like universal background checks and stuff like that, this stuff is not like some minority that is in support of this. Okay, we are talking about like 70% roughly of the American people who are in support of some of these common sense gun reforms. Okay, and these Tennessee lawmakers not only ignore the will of the people in that sense, but then expel their elected representatives, right? A representative from Nashville, a representative from Memphis, Tennessee, two of the largest cities in the state. And they now have no representation within this body. in order to try to actually push forward with meaningful legislation to prevent this type of thing from happening in the future. I mean, it's obviously just a disgusting situation. I'll leave it up to you guys how you want to analyze the fact that 2 of the youngest black representatives were expelled while the only white woman was not expelled, even though she participated in the protest as well. I'll leave that up to you guys and her interpretation of that situation as well. But I mean, look at what we're dealing with as a country right now. I mean, this is the only country on the face of the planet where these kinds of mass shootings happen on a regular basis like this. And we not only don't even have real legislation being brought forward, but they're almost doubling down on the wrong solutions to take us in the wrong direction, where the solution is somehow okay, we need a police officer in every single school. We need teachers to be armed. Okay, we need to just flood the zone with more and more guns in order to address this problem. Even though the only actual, good faith interpretation of this situation, and again, I'm not even a necessarily super anti-gun person, abolish all guns or anything like that. But if you want to look at the data, I mean, the X factor here, the only factor that you could possibly get to, in terms of what is the difference between the United States seeing hundreds of mass shootings a year versus all of these other European countries, OECD countries that are comparable to the US. Okay, what is the X factor there? Is it mental health care? Maybe to some degree. We don't have universal health care. That would definitely help the situation. But it's the guns. I mean, it's just it's that simple, right? We have a proliferation of guns. We have more guns than people in this country. And then we turn around and we're shocked at the idea that we have more gun violence, that we have more gun deaths. I mean, just the statistic that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks in this country. I mean, we've seen data come out. The number one killer of American children right now is guns. It's not car accidents. It's not some other illness or some other, tragic event. It's guns. I mean, what a horrific situation that we are dealing with right now. And honestly, again, it's dark and, you feel solidarity for the protesters here. You feel solidarity for the representatives who were kicked out of their seats as a result of this. But I mean, it's so dark that we are living in a situation where we cannot even have accurate conversations about how to address this problem when the solutions are pretty fucking simple.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying